TorahCafe.com.
Rabbi, I want to sort of, go back to something. You've made reference several times, and as did Rabbi Lubin, to Jewish legal ethics. And you've made reference in the course of your responses to Jewish legal ethics. For those of us who happen not to be Jewish, what is the difference as we're talking about these ethical dilemmas, these complex and difficult and often confusing, confounding issues? What's the difference?
Well, I'll start by giving a plug to one of your sponsors. LexisNexis has published a fine book which is on the table by my colleague, Professor Resnikoff. It's a book worth reading, actually, for those who won it in the lottery. But the Jewish tradition is at its core more inquisitorial, less adversarial, more comfortable with justice being the primary focus, and not imagining that the judge is just, in the words of Chief Justice Robert, an umpire who calls the balls and strikes. The idea that what we want at a trial is a just outcome seems very central. It's not just a clash between two titans. It's an opportunity for us as a society to make just determinations. And thus it's much more, I think, justice-focused than the adversarial system we have in the United States, where the judge's role is less active and thus less focused on making sure that the just outcome occurs on one foot.
Okay. Are you saying if one were to practice, Robert Boyd, what you described, that he or she, if they were practicing in this tradition, would be less interested in fighting to win rather than to come to a just conclusion?
I think the Jewish tradition wants all of the attorneys to be focused on a just outcome, and the judge as well. And that there's a reason why the classical verses say, justice, justice, you should pursue. Could have said, victory, victory, you should pursue. But we're always afraid of the conversation from the client to his lawyer, where the client calls up and said, victory triumphed. And the lawyer responded by saying, don't worry, we'll win on appeal. The goal of the system in the Jewish tradition is justice. It's not winning at any cost. It's about making sure that the just outcome occurs. It's a different model than the model we're all used to.
Judge, any comment on that?
Translated into an American system, part of what the rabbi is saying would in fact be that judges would be judge, jury, and potentially executioner. The inquisitorial system, in fact, focuses on the fact that the judge does the initial inquiry into whether or not the charges should be brought. In Europe, they call them investigating magistrates.
Yes.
And they bring the initial charges. And then another part of the judiciary, in fact, tries the case. And the lawyers are essentially just a sideshow. It is basically, the judge is the kingpin. And by the way, typically in that kind of situation, for example, some of our cherished beliefs like the right to remain silent, that you are presumed innocent unless and until you're proven guilty is proven beyond a reasonable doubt, are generally not part of that type of system.
What we're talking about here is, we have two ethical obligations, and all sometimes they're in conflict. We have an ethical obligation to zealously represent our clients. And we have an ethical obligation to be officers of the court. And sometimes when you have those two ethical obligations, there is tension between the two.
Okay, this last video is an interesting, there are two pieces of video, right, Rabbi? Rabbi Lubin and the team have put together two pieces of video, and on the surface they may not seem like they are connected, but they are connected to a larger question. Under the category of sports bounties. The first clip you will see refers to the New Orleans Saints, a professional football team, and the sports bounty that you may or may not have heard about, where the players on the team were rewarded for taking out, hurting players on the opposing team. And apparently coaches were involved, and this was a very successful, win-at-all-costs professional football team. And the NFL, the National Football League, came down on the New Orleans Saints and the coaches, and they got heavy, heavy sanctions. And again, as I said, many of those sanctions were lifted just a few days ago for the players. The second clip you will see has to do with the president of the NCAA, National Collegiate Athletic Association, talking about the Penn State case, speaking about the role that collegiate sports play in society and the impact of the win-at-all-costs attitude at Penn State, and the clips speak for themselves. Let's go to the videotape.
Tonight, one of the biggest penalties in the history of sports. The NFL levies unprecedented suspensions for paying players for excessive violence.
The essence of the situation, Scott, is that the head coach is the face of the organization. He runs the show there. And the fact that Sean Payton, the head coach, knew that this system, this bounty program was in place, he effectively lied about it when the commissioner and league authorities asked about it. So that explains why the penalty was so severe.
The Penn State case has provoked in all of us deeply powerful emotions and shaken our most fundamental confidence in many ways. As President Ray just said, the fundamental message here, the gut check message is, do we have the right balance in our culture? Do we have, first and foremost, the academic values of integrity and honesty and responsibility as the drivers of our university, or are we in a position where hero worship and winning at all costs has subordinated those core values? If that's the case, then you need to address that, and need to address that as quickly as you can. That's the lesson here.
Rabbi, question. Why is it that we have the NCAA ruling, deciding on the fate of Penn State and its football program, and the National Football League deciding on the fate of these players who were, some might argue, using their bodies as weapons to assault players on the opposing team for money? Why would it not be that the legal community, the criminal justice community, were not dealing with these matters?
I guess the two cases really are very different, because the New Orleans Saints matter is about, at some level, cheating in professional sports. The Penn State matter is about misbehavior, terrible, egregious, unconscionable misbehavior by a coach, but unrelated to the game of football. I think that the Jewish tradition kind of recognizes that organizations like football, which don't really entail intense violence, nobody, even in these bounties, were profoundly hurt. They were knocked out of the game.
They could have been killed.
They could have been.
They could have been they could have been paralyzed. They could have had their lives altered forever.
I think if somebody had been paralyzed, this would have been an appropriate legal matter, but this is closer to cheating in a game of chess. Meaning, this is something that needs to be assessed by the community, at least in the Saints matter, by the organization that governs football.
Let's stay on this, Rabbi. A 300-pound professional football player running a 40-yard dash in less than 5 seconds with a helmet on, using that helmet as a weapon to smash into another player, potentially helmet to helmet. Are we not simply lucky? Are those other players simply not fortunate and lucky that they were not maimed?
It could be, of course, but that's a description of football with or without the bounty. Maybe that's an argument against violent sports in general. But to the extent that we're uncomfortable with consent as this justification, let's step back and look at the sport called boxing, and ask ourselves, How comfortable are we in a society in which we put two people in a ring and the winner is the one who hits the loser in the head hard enough that he falls unconscious and can't get up?
Those are the rules.
Those are the rules.
In
I get
football,
it.
Respectfully, Rabbi, in football, those are not the rules. In this case, these players were being paid to take out another player, so that player was incapacitated. That's not different?
Sure, I guess boxing is more problematic. In boxing, we come to here while one person beats another person with his consent into unconsciousness, to which your response is, well, that's perfectly ethical because those are the rules.
Rabbi, respectfully, I did not say that. I said it is up front what the rules are. This, by the way, the difference here is clear to me. One, the rules are up front, are advertised and promoted. In the other one, they were secret, they were lied about, and clearly they never wanted to become public. Judge, do you see the difference?
I see a tremendous difference. As far as I'm concerned, what the Saints did was, at a minimum, civilly actionable and quite arguably criminally actionable. The difference in the consent is just striking. What the Saints were doing was the equivalent of having a boxer putting lead shot into his boxing gloves. If I'm a boxer, I consent to, in fact, a game by the rules, and I consent to what the ordinary consequences of engaging in that particular event are. If I'm a football player, I don't consent to people intentionally trying to injure me. I accept the fact that I may be injured as a part of the ordinary execution of good plays or imperfect execution of bad plays. But I don't consent to people trying to break my legs, arms purposely so they can collect the bounty and put me out of the game. And as far as I'm concerned, the Saint situation clearly would be something which would be subject to the civil court system and potentially the criminal system.
So in your mind, having the NFL adjudicate this issue, beginning and end, it's our call, has nothing to do with the government, they have no involvement, you question that?
I certainly do.
Mike.
Well, Steve, at the risk of offending the next prosecutor of Morris County, Mr. Knapp, let me take your hypothetical to attack the government. I mean, the premise of your statement in terms of the utilization of bounties to achieve a tainted result is an appropriate one. Because when we're paying bounties, we're concerned that people are going to act unethically, improperly. Well, the government does that often when they utilize cooperating witnesses. Instead of New Orleans Saints, it's Team America. But they're paying a bounty to someone to achieve a result. And we have to be concerned that when we use that bounty system, just as we don't want to use it with football players, we have to be careful when we use it against citizens of the United States of America. Now, a few years ago, the judge will know this, was a great case that lived for about 2 days. U.S. versus Singleton, where the 10th Circuit was dealing with the anti-bribery statute. And it said the government violated the anti-bribery statute when it paid an inducement to a government witness to appear at trial. And it cited the statute, and I forget what the words were, but the words basically said, whoever pays money to induce someone to testify is in violation of the anti-bribery statute. Well, that lasted for about 2 weeks. It went on en banc, and the 10th Circuit then said, wait a second, whoever doesn't mean whoever. Whoever doesn't apply to us. Whoever just means on the defense side. If you pay or do something to induce a witness to testify, we're going to indict you for obstruction of justice. But if we do it, it's the sovereign's prerogative.
Rabbi.
I want to step back and reflect broader on the society we're living in, because the whole approach troubles me. In truth, I find the idea as a society that we're comfortable with the consent culture of boxing or football, in which people consciously engage in violence to hurt other people so we can cheer and watch. This is problematic. At its core, this is the most problematic aspect of our society, which is we're enjoying the pain inflicted on others so that we can see some gratuitous violence here. I find football violence, truth be told, less problematic than boxing violence. First of all, because of consent, but second of all, even though people could have been severely injured, severe injuries are exceptionally rare because everybody wears a pad and a helmet. The idea that we as a society watch this gratuitous violence, I think, is an anathema to any ethical tradition. That we'll watch two people hit each other with or without consent. This ought to be a sporting activity that good people don't go to.
At the risk. I mean, as a boxing, listen, I'm not a boxing historian, but I had the great Bert Sugar on one time in a PBS interview, and he was talking about some of the greatest boxers that he had ever seen, and many of them happen to be Jewish. And many of them happen to come from the poorest communities in New York City and Philadelphia and other communities. But Rabbi, I remember Bert Sugar saying that for many poor ethnic Americans who came to this country, and for many today who happen to be poor, living in certain communities, boxing happens to be a way out. All I'm saying is, I don't want to make this about boxing or football, but to argue that certain sports, for those who consent to be involved and know what the rules are, that's problematic because you find it to be uncomfortable, versus football where we know where the rules are and someone cheats, changes the game to take somebody out and gets money for it. I'm amazed at that.
I guess if people were seriously hurt by the bounty
That's out of luck.
process, I would find it troubling as well. My recollection of the case is that, in fact, nobody was hurt. Nobody was hurt. Again, I don't have a problem with the idea that if cheating resulted in somebody being seriously hurt, that would be a matter for the civil or the criminal authorities. I could recognize that fact. Certainly, if the defensive end took out a pistol and shot the quarterback, that would be a matter for criminal court.
All right, now here we go. Let me ask you this. I know there are not, I know there happen not to be a lot of Italian Americans in hockey. Are there a lot of, I don't know, I'm not an expert in this. Are there a lot of people who happen to be of the Jewish faith in hockey? I don't think so. No rabbis in hockey that you know of. No, they are, okay, here's the thing. In hockey, a fight breaks out.
I thought a hockey game breaks out in a boxing match on ice.
Okay. So here's the deal. A hockey game is being played at The Rock, at Prudential, downtown North. And a fight breaks out. And all hell breaks loose. And they're punching at first, and then a guy takes the stick, whacks the other guy over the head, cracks his head open, the guy's bleeding out on the ice. Not only does he have a concussion, not only does he have 100 stitches, not only does he have brain damage, but the guy is hanging on by a thread. Is that a matter for the National Hockey League, or is that a matter for the prosecutor's office in Essex County? Judge.
As far as I'm concerned, it's a matter for the county prosecutor's office, all right? There is no consent to being intentionally hit over the head in hockey. It is well known that the sport has violent aspects to it, and it's well known that people play the game rough and hard, but there's all the difference in the world between intentionally trying to injure somebody and having that injury part of a very rough contact sport.
And Judge, if that player whose head is split open and is hanging on by a thread was the star player of the Devils or whatever team, and that player was taken out by the other player because there was a bounty on that player's head, how is that any different than what we are describing with the New Orleans Saints? And therefore, are we not talking about something very comparable where the government must get involved and prosecute?
I think it's certainly an area where the government could prosecute. I don't tell prosecutors what to do.
Then are we not simply fortunate that there was not an outcome that did not cause serious bodily harm, potentially death, or someone being paralyzed with these injuries? Because the rabbi has said many times, well, as far as I know, there were no serious injuries.
And frankly, we don't know if similar bounties exist in other teams, and we do know there have been very serious injuries to football players.
Right.
My problem goes as follows. Imagine if the rules of hockey were amended to permit hitting with a stick. The fans would finally go to hockey games. Would that make it a more ethical sport? Our moderator has said yes.
I have not.
Yes, you have.
I am offended by you putting those words in my mouth.
Focused on consent. In my view, the fact that you've consented to be hit on the head by a hockey stick makes the sport more repugnant rather than less.
Rabbi, you are very, very good. You are very good. I give you credit for making words up that I did not say. However, I would enjoy engaging you in spirited discourse on PBS. However, what I'm saying, Mike, is whose job is it to regulate these activities in professional and or collegiate? Go back to the Penn State case. Is it the job of the NCAA? Is it the job, and I know we're going to say case by case, but ultimately, how is it that these entities are regulating themselves when you do have these are potentially criminal activities? Why isn't the government just as involved in these cases as they are in every other case involving some of the same activities?
Just as Judge Chesler said, it's a question of proof. If you have a factual pattern where, whatever sport, let's now go into baseball, we've been close every activity. Suppose we have the pitcher who tells his co-player the night before, the Yankees, I'm going to take Derek Jeter out tomorrow. And he has great control. I'm going to throw it right at his head, and I'm going to, once you do that, it's not a game of accident. This guy has tremendous control. He told somebody he's going to take Jeter out, and he took him out. But you don't get that situation. Normally, it's part of the game, as the rabbi said, and we have to deal with it. The question is, do we want, as a society, to engage this type of amphitheater type of activity?
Yes, Judge?
Well, I just wanted to go to the rabbi's comment.
You want to defend me, do you not, Judge?
What's that?
You want to defend me, do you not?
I've already defended you.
Well, I can appreciate
I think that, look, Penn State is a governmental matter. The government has prosecuted Sandusky.
Not the sanctions. The sanctions were handed down by the National Collegiate Athletic Association.
But the sanctions are, look, the athletic sanctions are a governing body issue. The question is whether or not criminal and civil actions should and could be brought.
On the university, not Sandusky.
If there's a basis for a criminal prosecution against, or a civil case against the university, and I expect that there probably will be civil suits against the university arising out of that.
I believe the general counsel was arrested because he was a mandatory reporter and didn't report.
Which is not so much an ethical issue, but more of a legal one, because it is in the law that he was required to report that. So what's interesting to me is that the NCAA moved as quickly as they did to come up with these fines, or excuse me, these fines before anyone else did. Well, I'm so glad that we agree on these issues. I'm so glad we've come to an agreement on them.